Hey guys, this is Yoda. This will be my Blood Decay guide for Season 2 War Within. As always, the most asked question about Blood Decay is, does it get one shot in high keys? Answer to that is, at least before the 0.5 patch, there is no key level another tank can survive that Blood Decay cannot survive with proper play. However, if you mismanage your cooldowns, then Blood Decay's punishment is usually death or purgatory. Another tank's punishment may just be, going to low percent health. With Blood Decay, make sure you are aware of all damage that you're taking. Right, for our default build, we are going to be recommending Sand Lane for Season 2. The damage gain is just too good to pass up. There is some evidence that Deathbringer may be slightly better for survivability. However, I'm always going to recommend relatively higher damage build. So this is the talents that I recommend for Sand Lane as a generic build. However, note that this is a very aggressive build. This is playing for damage. If you want to play for a bit more survivability, you can drop the 1 point in hemostasis for improved vamp blood. Another swap you can also do is improved hard strike. I think they're worth about 2 to 4% damage per point. Same with hemostasis. You can drop these for mass grip and either tightening grasp or blood tap if you really want blood tap. And you can also drop bloodshot for umbilicus if you're having a lot of trouble surviving massive pulls. Like for instance, the start of Cinderbrometery can be a struggle sometimes. But outside of pulls like that, umbilicus is not super useful, especially low target count pulls. It's basically useless. So I would recommend trying to play bloodshot as much as possible in the new season. It works really well with your tier set and works really well with Sand Lane, since a big portion of your damage is going to be coming from Death Strike. If you end up dropping bloodshot, you have the option of changing Iron Heart for Bloodied Blade. I think part of Bloodied Blade is still bugged, but part of it works. So like as half a talent, it is still giving you quite a bit of damage. So that is a swap that you could consider if you drop out Bloodshot, just to recoup some damage. On the left side, you have some choices. Right now I'm defaulting Grip of the Dead, but you can also just play Soul Reaper for a little bit more damage. We're also taking Blood Draw right now with the default build, but you can drop that for Control Undead or Assimilation, depending on the key. If 130 AMZ is super useful. Control Undead is mostly used to keep Eye of Kazan stacked, so Eye of Kazan is a really OP trinket from the raid this season. Extremely overtuned. However, in keys, you drop combat a lot. The stacks off tend to drop off, so it's not as good. However, with Control Undead, if you have a mob controlled, then the stacks don't fall off. So in Theater of Pain, I think is the only dungeon you can actually use that in. Control Undead is very useful with Eye of Kazan. You can also drop a Asphyxiate for another talent, but I pretty much never do that, so I'm not going to recommend it to other people. So those are the talents. For stats, in my opinion, Verse is going to be your best stat. It is pretty good offensively and is by far the best defensively. In pure AoE, Haste is going to be better than Verse, like by a lot. It's the best stat by a lot for for any tank, honestly, in AoE, because more Haste is more Blood Beast stacks, or sorry, more Blood Beast procs, which is responsible for most of your AoE damage. However, Haste is not that good defensively, so I would prioritize Verse over Haste. And also Mastery is going to be your second best defensive stat, definitely better than Haste. Crit is probably not going to be good. Like, it's okay. It's honestly pretty good single target, but in AoE, it is not very good. So I would stay away from Crit if you can. So generally, I would prioritize Verse, then Haste, and then Mastery would be if you're having trouble surviving. In terms of your weapon rune, you can play Rune of Sanguination for low target cleave or single target, or Fallen Crusader for big overall / pad damage. Personally, I think Rune of Sanguination might be the better choice for most dungeons, but if you like doing big overall, Fallen Crusader is also a good choice. There is also Stoneskin Gargoyle if you need just a little bit more survivability, but I think it is probably better to do like a lot of other options than going to Stoneskin Gargoyle. So I would stick with one of the other two damage runes instead. For your trinkets, Tome of Light's Devotion is the best trinket pretty much for all tanks. Kind of sucks for Blood Decay because Tome comes with a little bit of crit that is, it's not useless, but it's not your best stat either. But the single target damage that you're getting from Tome is very good. Not know how to use Tome, then there is a trinket video on my YouTube channel. Be sure to check that out. It is very important that you are using Tome to keep it in offense mode only. If it is in defense mode, then it is completely useless. So make sure you know how to use that and you're keeping it in offense mode. Alright, for Alkstone, this is going to be your second best trinket. It's basically just a Verse stat stick versus your best stat, so there we are. If you have like a mythic House of Cards randomly, you could consider using it, especially early on in the season. Mastery is not terrible, but on-use trinkets generally aren't that good for tanks. Blood Decay is no exception. For Viscera of Coolest Hatred, this is going to be a pretty good damage trinket. I would rate it, you know, 4th on the list, but it is still pretty good, especially if you want more single target. It's probably like 2nd on the list for single target after Tome. Absorb trinkets for Blood Decay are usually pretty bad compared to how they're used for other tanks. Blood Decay has infinite self-sustain, so the absorb trinkets are basically only used to prevent you from getting one shot and basically only used on pull. There are maybe some situations where you could say, oh no, I'm out of cooldowns, and you can use an absorb trinket to help you survive like 2 more seconds. But generally, absorb trinkets are not good for Blood Decay. Really only useful on pull, and you could just ask your healer for an external instead on pull, or use IBF and ask your healer for external later, whatever you want. But yeah, absorb trinkets are there. A lot of tanks do prefer using them in Mythic Plus. Personally, I would not use them as Blood Decay, but yeah. All right, special items. So in your endgame setup, best in slots will be the best item. However, you probably won't use that early on in the season. We'll explain that later. Thirsty Circlet is going to be good early season, but once you get a higher level ring, you'll basically just not use Thirsty Circlet anymore. As for embellishments, oh, there is another item called the Jester Diamond. If you get that on Mythic, I would consider using it. However, it has no verse, so it's not going to be that good. All right, for embellishments, endgame Dust Thread Lining is probably going to be your best bet. However, early on in the season, Ascendance is usually considered really good because it lets you craft a 675 weapon. Having a mythic weapon early on in the season is like considered, you know, your strongest item, so it's a really big boost in power. So a lot of people just craft Ascendance, and then once they're fully geared and they cannot use any more crests, they use those crests to like swap their embellishments to Dust Thread. And hopefully you have a best in slots by then, and you can also swap to that. So that's usually the embellishment strategy. That's what it was in season 1. I've not seen a reason for it to change in season 2. For your cooldowns, so Dancing Rune Weapon is going to be your most used cooldown, or you know, your best cooldown. It has very strong offensive benefits, especially as Sand Lane. It basically activates your hero tree. It turns all of your Heart Strikes into Vamp Strikes, which can proc your Blood Beast very often and does all the other things Vamp Strike does. It makes your Marrow Rend give you 9 Road Shield stacks, or your Death Caress gives you 6 Bone Shield stacks. Usually you're not Death Caressing in Rune Weapon though. It also gives you some parry. The biggest struggle with Dancing Rune Weapon, especially as Sand Lane, is you need to balance the Marrow Rend or slash Bone Shield economy that it gives you against getting extra Vamp Strikes. In my opinion, it's usually good to do 1 Marrow Rend in Dancing Rune Weapon and not anymore. You have more globals to use on Vamp Strikes. You really want to be spamming Vamp Strike as much as possible in Dancing Rune Weapon. Don't overcap on RP though, unless it's like an actual massive pull and you only care about Blood Beast for some reason. Dancing Rune Weapon is going to be your strongest cooldown by far, offensively and defensively, in my opinion. All right, we also have Vamp Blood, which has a very, very low cooldown due to Red Thirst. It's also probably your strongest cooldown. It gives you a lot of max health and healing increased. If you're playing UE, this is also pretty useful in massive AoE. Generally, I would say just use Vamp Blood off cooldown. Even if it's overlapping with other stuff, sometimes you could consider holding it like 1 or 2 globals or a few seconds if you want to, but you know, if you hold it, you will notice yourself falling behind on self-healing, so do consider that. All right, Anti-Magic Shell. This is 40-second cooldown, and it's also off global, so this is a really strong cooldown against anything magical. Especially a lot of boss tank busters in or within season 2 are like hitting the tank for a lot of magic damage and then applying a debuff. Well, as if you have Anti-Magic Shell, then generally you will like take no damage from it, and then you also won't get a debuff. So Anti-Magic Shell is extremely overpowered against a lot of tank busters. In my opinion, one of the main things that's making Blood Decay good. We also have Rune Tap. So this is a talent that I take pretty much unconditionally. You can choose to not play Rune Tap in certain builds, especially in low keys where you don't need it. But just a quick note, in my experience, you know, it doesn't make sense that people are saying, oh, Blood Decay's main weakness is that it gets one-shot in high keys, and then we're just not playing Rune Tap, which is the best like anti-one-shot talent in the game. So Rune Tap, in my opinion, is very useful. Use it to fill in for other defensives, like if you don't have a defensive coming up, but you will have one in 4 seconds, which happens a lot with Vamp Blood, you can just Rune Tap instead. You can also just send one on pull to give you enough RP for your first Death Strike, and also Blood Decay is pretty vulnerable on pull, so up there is very useful. Alright, Lichborn. So this has a 2-minute cooldown for Blood Decay. It is actually a pretty weak cooldown, giving you only 15% damage reduction. Also makes you immune to fear, but that doesn't really matter. I would generally try not to have Lichborn as a solo cooldown. Try to pair it with something else like Vamp Blood, Rune Tap, etc. If you're in like a big pull, don't say like, ooh, I have Lichborn now, I'm going to survive. That's not going to be the case at all. Make sure it's paired with something else. Icebound, on the other hand, 30% DR. is usually good enough. By itself, it's like not that strong. Usually, if you're depending on Icebound or Lichborn, you're gonna want to start with a lot of RP. Since this doesn't really do anything for your self healing, it only does stuff for like your damage intake. It's like good for not getting one shot, but it's not that useful for your RP/health economy. It'll make more sense when you play with it more. But yeah, generally you don't want to overlap this with rune weapons, since those are your two strongest cooldowns. You want to use them separately. Also, if you ever get stunned or want to stand in something that would stun you, you can do that with Icebound. Also be careful. Honestly, this is not really something you can play around, but if you push Icebound and then you proc your Tierset, then the new Icebound overrides the duration, which means it like makes it shorter. Unfortunate bug, but yeah, just be aware of it. Okay, Bone Storm and Tombstone. So these are costing 5 Bone Shield charges each. The biggest reason to use them is to proc Shattering Bone and also to reduce the cooldown of your Dancing Rune Weapon. As a general rule, especially at Sand Lane, we want to be using Bone Storm off cooldown pretty much no matter what, if you can. It gives you back Bone Shields. Tombstone you can hold, or after Rune Weapon, you get more Vamp Strikes off. If you happen to proc Blood Beast and that Blood Beast is going to fall off, and you want to Tombstone in that window in AoE, you get more damage from Pact of the Sand Lane. Also against certain tank buster type mobs, mostly bosses, you can delay Tombstone a bit as a rotation against a tank buster. For instance, Gortrop in Theater of Pain is a really good example of that. You can't really have a cooldown for every single Hateful Strike, but if you have Tombstone, if you work Tombstone into the rotation, then you will have one for like way more of the Hateful Strikes. All right, A-Bomb Limb is generally going to be used for utility, and Threat on Pull is honestly like the best quote-unquote utility that you can get from it. Obviously you want to be using it off cooldown because it does damage. Utility uses for it, in my opinion, are way more useful. Can't really think of any examples of bosses where you need to save A-Bomb Limb in War Within Season 2, but just generally like using it on pull of a pull is super good because it grips anything that's far away and also just gives you good threat on pull. All right, defensive rotation. So plan generally is to use Rune Weapon, you know, as many times as possible, and use that like as your defensive cooldown and your offensive cooldown at the same time. Pull, we're going to send Rune Weapon and Vamp Blood if possible, plus Rune Tap. Remember, vulnerable on pull. After Rune Weapon falls off, you're going to do Lichborn and Rune Tap. Usually, depending on the pull, you know, sometimes you don't need to use Lichborn. Plus the Vamp Blood when it comes back. Remember, I said Lichborn alone is viable. Can also Lichborn on pull if you really need it. If it's like a super tough pull, for instance, like the whole first Rumor Workshop or something, probably want to use Lichborn on pull as well, just to overlap everything. Anyway, after that, you have Vamp Blood and, you know, Lichborn maybe to make time for your next Rune Weapon. After your next Rune Weapon, you would probably go into Icebound if you needed it, and then Vamp Blood again after. And then hopefully stuff is dead enough, or you could kite until your next Rune Weapon. Also in those big pulls, if you have Umbilicus, then you can like delay every single cooldown. You can just like wait a couple seconds after Vamp Blood to let your shield take some damage before using the cooldown. This is like kind of useful for surviving in big pulls for a little bit longer. That's the main use for UE. All right, against bosses, you need to change your cooldown rotation a little bit, since Dancing Rune Weapon is basically useless against tank busters. However, the bosses aren't exactly like hitting you with tank busters back to back to back to back like War Within Season 1. So it's basically just have a cooldown rotation that you're thinking about. We're going to do an example video. So we're going, by the way, this video is a full world tour of all 8 dungeons as Blood DK. If you ever need to reference something, this is a great video. I recommend checking it out. So this is the first pull of Workshop here. We're going to talk about how we set it up. So we Vamp Blood before anything. We're not Rune Weaponing yet, because generally you want a Rune Weapon once everything is gathered, or you can use it like as your last global of the gather. So we're walking through with Vamp Blood only, and we're going to get aggro with Blood Boil. Then we tag the far pack, A-Bomb Limb, and walk into everything. I actually Icebound in here on pull. I think this is a mistake. I think this should have been Lichborn instead of Icebound, but I just panicked for some reason when I was low health. Obviously, as you can see, I didn't die, and I was just one death strike and I was full health, so it was basically a complete waste. Especially because I proc Tierset. Anyway, we Rune Weapon to aggro the last pack, then Bone Storm, and then we're just going to spam Vamp Strike, ideally, or we're going to miss globals. All right, we're spamming Vamp Strike. Be aware that once your whatever cooldown you were using on pull falls off, you are going to take some damage. Once the Rune Weapon falls off, this is honestly kind of sloppy. I like waited a little bit too long before using Lichborn. Should have used it earlier. Obviously, Lichborn instead of IVF here results in a purg, but we survive. Healer also PSs me because he's like, oh my god, my tank perked. But yeah, this should have been Lichborn on pull. Icebound here. Detonate goes off and kills my group, but fortunately, we're playing Blood DK, so we are not going to die here. Once Lichborn is out, we have Rune Weapon and Vamp Blood back. That's a really big Umbilicus shield and a big pull. Once that Rune Weapon falls off, we have Vamp Blood back again. Note that we're using Vamp Blood like a lot of Vamp Bloods in a pull like this. Once this Vamp Blood falls off, we're going to get Umbilicus, and that's basically GG. We cannot die from there. If the pull was still alive, by the way, after this Umbilicus ran out, we would be kiting. We wouldn't be kiting for that long. We'd basically be kiting until Bone Storm and Tombstone are back, and then we'd, have Rune Weapon again. So, alright, that is a basic example of how to do a big pull. Remember, the I spawn and pull, not ideal. Alright, basic example of a boss. We're just going to go through like the first three, but this boss is omega easy for Blood Decay. For Electric Crush, you can just like AMS, and as you can see, against a normal tank, this would do like, taking a lot of your health bar, but for a Blood Decay, you just completely immune it. Fast forward to the next Electro Crush. We have like basically nothing up. As a Blood Decay, honestly, you're yellowing these bosses a lot of the time. Defensively, we just rune tap it with Vamp Blood up. One Death Strike, and we're back. So it's not really too much to see here, other than just trying to show that these bosses are omega easy for Blood Decay, whereas for other tanks, they can be quite difficult. So for offensively, there's a few things you need to keep in mind. I'm gonna send your cooldowns off cooldown, because they're not doing anything if they're, just sitting there. So the biggest cooldown you want to use is Rune Weapon, as we already talked about. Also want to use Bone Storm as much as possible. There's a few general rules. Obviously, Bone Storm and Tombstone do consume Bone Shield stacks, and you don't want to be below 5 stacks for too long because of Ossuary. You definitely don't want to go to 0 stacks, because you'll just die to melees. So make sure you have 6+ on Bone Shields when you use Tombstone or Bone Storm, and I believe the rule is 8+ for Tombstone. Also, when you use these, they cool down your Dancing Rune Weapon, and you want to be using your Rune Weapons. The max cooldown value is like at 25 seconds, but it's possible to use these at 15 seconds left on Rune Weapon. Just eat a little bit of the cooldown reduction. You get like extra uses out of the Bone Storm and the Tombstone. Obviously, we talked about A-Bomb Limb already. You want to use this as much as possible, but it's also really useful for grouping. And we're also playing Consumption. You do want to use this as much as possible. Mostly, the consideration is don't overcap runes. Like, this gives you 2 runes when you use it. So if you have 6 runes and you push it, then you're completely wasting part of it. You also have Raise Ghoul. Not the biggest deal, but it's also free because it's off global, so just use it. There's also a few buffs you need to keep in mind. So there's your Death and Decay. This should have roughly 100% uptime. With the changes they did in War Within, you have like, I think it lasts for 10 seconds, and then when you leave it, it's still up for 4 seconds. And the cooldown is 15 seconds, plus it gives you resets. So you should realistically have 100% uptime on D&D. This is pretty important to stay in, especially as Sand Lane, since you have a talent that gives you 5% DR. And also generally you just want to be in your D&D anyway because of Heartstrike Cleave and Haste. So make sure you're in that. Bone Shields, you want to manage your Bone Shields really well. For Sand Lane, it is a little bit harder than as Deathbringer, because as Deathbringer you were getting Marrow casts that you actually wanted to do because of Exterminate. As Sand Lane, you do not have those exterminates that you're going to want to use. Your Bone Shield management is a little bit more awkward. I would say generally just like using Rune Weapon is giving you 5 shields, and then if you do 1 Marrow Rend per Rune Weapon, you should be able to maintain like high enough Bone Shield stacks throughout most of the key. However, especially as Sand Lane, you are going to need to actually Marrow Rend or Death Caress upkeep your Bone Shields throughout the key. Be aware that when you do that, it costs 2 runes when you Marrow Rend, so you might run out of runes later. Try to play around that by having Consumption, etc., or just generally like be aware of it. Coagulopathy in Season 2 is now 12 seconds, so I don't really see the need to track it anymore. If you're like at your keyboard, then it'll be up as long as you're not out of combat. Blood Plague, definitely you want to maintain this. There is some part of Sand Lane, so when you use your Rune Weapon, it's activating your Sand Lane hero tree. Every Vamp Strike you do is extending your Blood Plague while you're in Rune Weapon, but then after Rune Weapon falls off, your next Heart Strike, by the way, it's very important that this Heart Strike is D&D, or AoE, will consume all of your Blood Plagues. It does not consume your Rune Weapon Blood Plagues, only your main Blood Plague. It consumes all of your Blood Plagues, and it does like all of their damage at once. It's like a pretty big hit. It's called Inflict Sorrow. After you consume Infliction, you want to re-Blood Plague to just reapply it. Also, if you're playing Hemostasis, then you want to Blood Boil whenever you have 3 runes charging down and you're about to Death Strike, if possible. Not like the biggest deal, honestly. If you play around that perfectly, it's like a 2% damage gain, but it is there. So, Blood Beast, you're gonna want to track Blood Beast. It's not doesn't really change your rotation that much, but it's just like such a big portion of your damage. It kind of makes sense in my opinion to track it. So whenever your Blood Beast procs, I think 10 seconds. It lasts 10 seconds. Whenever it dies, there's a talent called Pact of the Sand Lane. It tracks how much shadow damage you've done, and then it explodes on everything nearby. This is like the biggest source of your damage in uncapped AoE. The main reason that haste is actually really good for Sand Lane in AoE. Whenever it procs, the biggest rotation change is that you want to prioritize your Tombstone as much as possible, whereas before you were kind of holding Tombstone until after Rune Weapon. And if you have anything shadow damage, like a few more Blood Boils maybe, or Vamp Strikes, I guess you're already prioritizing Vamp Strikes, but basically you don't need to change your rotation that much. It just be aware of it because it's going to increase your damage by a lot. Biggest thing is try to make sure you get your Tombstone in there, or A-Bomb Loom if you're holding it. Maybe you just send it instead, something like that. We also have Luck of the Draw. It's the new tier set. Whenever it procs, it gives you a free IBF. But the other thing is that it makes your Death Strike hit 3 targets. At not like usually when things hit multiple targets because of a proc, they do reduce damage, but your Death Strikes are actually not reduced in Luck of the Draw. So it's a very important proc to find. Although again, it doesn't similar to Blood Beast, it doesn't really change your rotation that much. When this does proc, especially on AoE, you want to like prioritize Death Strike, I guess. Obviously, don't do yourself by using too many Death Strikes. But on 3-target cleave, for instance, as the buff is falling off, you may want to like dump your full RP pool into Death Strikes just to like get extra hits off from it. As for your resources, you have runes and RP. Don't overcap runes and don't overcap RP. So to not overcap RP, you basically only spend on Death Strike. So just Death Strike when it's about to be full. Simple enough. To not overcap runes, you basically just prioritize Vamp Strike or Hard Strike really high at all times. Once you have 3 runes cooling down at least, probably more if you have consumption off cooldown, you can start working some more Blood Boils into the rotation. One other thing, which is I'm going to add to the guide right now, is Essence of the Blood Queen. So when you're playing Sand Lane, there's a buff every time you Vamp Strike, it gives you Essence of the Blood Queen. When you're in your Rune Weapon, it's really easy to keep, but outside your Rune Weapon, you'll randomly get a free Vamp Strike, and you need to spend that to maintain Essence of the Blood Queen. Make sure you track that. Make sure to keep Essence of the Blood Queen. It should be possible to have 100% of the time in combat. Out of combat, this is going to fall off probably, depending on how long you're spending between packs. But in combat, it should be possible to have 100% of time. Opener generally is going to be like you just gather mobs down your D&D, and then I would Rune Weapon. So I would D&D like on the second to last pack, and then Rune Weapon to pull the last pack. You can Blood Boil. Blood Boil on you will hit everything near you, and the Blood Boil on your Rune Weapon will hit everything on your Rune Weapon. So you're like aggroing the last pack with Blood Boil, which gives you really good aggro on it. You're also Blood Boiling everything near you. Good aggro on that. Be very careful with this, however. If you Rune Weapon on a mob that like stands still, or a mob that moves really fast, then your weapon might be out of range for your next attack, which really sucks when that happens. Make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, and then you can Bone Storm immediately, and then Marrow Rend immediately to put yourself at 9. Go into your Sand Lane mode, which is just spam Vamp Strikes, and then Death Strike at max RP. After your weapon falls off, or if you get a Blood Beast proc like really early, like your first Vamp Strike or something, then you can Tombstone for that. Alright, Tierset we already mentioned, gives you a free IBF. It does override your current IBF, unfortunately, when it goes off. And also, it lets your Death Strike hit 3 targets, so on low target cleave, it's very important to get as many Death Strikes as possible into it. Alright, Blood Decay utility. So we have Death Grip. This is like your signature utility. It's really useful for just grouping mobs, like there's a random caster or archer not standing in the pack, boom, grip, he's in. You can also use it as a stop, so there's a lot of packs in War Within Season 2 that have like 2 casters, then, you know, people are going to use their kicks immediately, so don't grip like on pull. But if you notice that no one has a kick up, you can like grip or stun a mob to make sure that someone will have a kick up next time that it's about to cast. Use it as a taunt, so whenever you grip something, it automatically taunts it. Really good for getting aggro on stuff. This is actually really useful in Raid. Not really that useful in Mythic Plus since you have aggro on everything anyway. But in Raid, you can use this to prevent aggro issues. And countering fixate mobs. So in War Within Season 2, there's actually a lot of fixates. Particularly in Motherlode, the second boss has puts fixate ads on your range DPS all the time. If you grip and then Chains of Ice them, your range DPS, you're like, oh my god, I cannot. Also, there. The last area, there's a bunch of mines that fixate on not you anymore, but your DPS. Grip Slow is really useful against those as well. All right, you also have Asphyxiate. This is just like your average stun. Use it to make time for interrupts to come back or to stop interruptible abilities. Blinding Sleet is 1 minute AoE stop. It does also slow things, so you can use it as a slow if you need a kite. Chains of Ice is one of your unique utilities, I guess. We mentioned it earlier. It's really good at dealing with fixate mobs. One other instance I can think of that's not technically fixate is Cinderbrim Meadery. There's a boss called IPA, and he spawns a bunch of ads. If one of the ads is like really close to him, you can like slow it or stun it or something to make sure he doesn't eat it. And there's AMZ. This is your like main group utility. Keep people alive. There are a lot of heal checks in War Within Season 2. You notice that your group is about to die to one, you can also just slam it. Or ideally, there's just like a rotation and your AMZ is like on the first and the third or the fifth or something. The boss is AoE. But generally, just try to be aware when your group is taking high magic damage and use AMZ for that. You can use it for yourself, but generally I would say in War Within Season 2, there is no reason to use it for yourself. Any magical damage is just free because you have AMS anyway. We do also have Gore Fiends sometimes. Mass Grip plus AoE Silence if you want it. Usually you want to use this obviously when kicks are on cooldown, because if you silence everything but everyone has kick anyway, that doesn't do it, just kicked. You also have B-Res. We already talked about Avon Limb. You also have B-Res. Be ready to use it, but also it's kind of risky sometimes for your tank to B-Res. On bosses, I would say it's almost always free to use it, but in massive trash packs, like make sure you're gonna live before you commit to the B-Res, because if you die, it's way worse than the other person's thing. There are some soaks, I think, in the new season. Nothing really comes to mind immediately, I guess, for AMS and IBF, but if you soak something with AMS, a lot of the time, like, it would be really bad for someone else to soak it, but not for you. One example actually is in Prior of the Sacred Flame. The second boss has an ability where he like puts down a well and you have to soak 3 or 5 times, and whoever soaks gets a big debuff on them. As a DK, you can just AMS and run through it and you get no debuff. And also you have Death Advance, so you can Death Advance and AMS and then walk into it like back to back to back. It makes it way easier than any other tank taking the boss. Alright, for some random tricks, you want to pool your RP towards the end of a pack. Like, don't just slam Death Strike to finish off the mobs. So you have some RP going to the next pull. Remember we said Blood Decay is really vulnerable on pull, so having a Death Strike to recover that health really helps. There is something called mini kiting, so if we're playing Grip of the Dead, just being in your D&D is going to slow mobs. You don't want to get meleeed by them. Right now you can like take one small step back to like keep the mobs still grouped, but they're still not mailing you. Thing to keep in mind, you can do as a Blood Decay. Usually you would do this like when you don't have cooldowns. If you have cooldowns, it's much better to just like take the mobs, tank the mobs and let them hit you, and you Death Strike it back. But if you're running out of cooldowns, this is when you would use it. Obviously there's also full kiting. You can just run away if you need to, if you have no cooldowns. And Grip of the Dead is super useful there. You just slow mobs when you're running away. Blinding Sleet also works. Healthstone and Health Pot for Blood Decay usually are used on pull, because on pull is obviously your weakest point. Sometimes you need to do a bunch of gather globals, like you need to D&D, Rune Weapon, Blood Boil, all that. None of those generate RP, so you want to, or enough RP rather, for Death Strike. So in that window, oftentimes you can Healthstone Health Pot. Death Advance makes you immune to any slows. Immunes most pulls, but not all of them, and immunes all knockbacks. There are a few mobs in War Within that knock back the tank. If you don't want to get knocked back, then you can just Death Advance it. In the key, you can pre-stack Railred, so you can like drop a turnip and then hit it a couple times, then pull 10 and walk out and walk away, and then that should work. And then yeah, there's a special note about Northrend Engineering. So Blood Decay is known as one of the wheelchair tanks. Death Advance and Wraithwalk are really your only move speed boosts. A very useful tool on gathers, obviously this means you can't pot, is the Northrend Engineering Belt. There is a video on the channel, just type in engineering and search for it, and you'll find it. But there's an enchant in Northrend Engineering you can put on your belt that makes your belt like a speed boost, and it's super useful for Blood Decay. Make sure you are aware of that as well. Alright, so that does it for the Blood Decay guide. As always, if anything is really dumb,